name is Minh. I'm the Director of Strategic Programs at Notley, an organization that supports social impact initiatives in Central Texas and at large. Raised in the Central Texas area, son of refugees from Vietnam, and I've previously led diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy and programming for organizations like Capital Factory, but also have an extensive background in film and TV where I felt like storytelling was a really important thing that kind of helps drive more collaboration and more awareness and just better visibility to stories that people otherwise wouldn't be exposed to. So I'm really excited to be able to organize alongside the University of Texas Center for the Study of Race and Democracy this conversation around the model minority myth and its role in the United States. I want to give a special shout out to our community partners who have been able to really come together and share this event with all different all throughout, Central Texas and the different networks of communities that they engage with. I think it's really important for this specific conversation to understand how the model minority myth has not only affected the Asian American community, but also other communities of color. And so as you see, we really were intentional to try to bring in communities from all across the spectrum. So thank you again to our community partners for working with us in spreading the word about this event. For the agenda today, I just want to do some quick housekeeping to let you all know how the flow will go today. For a couple more minutes, I'll give a brief overview of Notley Tide, the organization that's helping lead this event, along with UT-CSRD, and they'll give a brief overview as well. And then for about 15 minutes, we're going to unpack the Asian model minority myth a little bit more, how it came to be, what it means to be quote unquote a model minority, and why that narrative was pushed. And Dr. Eric Tang will be leading that presentation. And then for the bulk of the event today, we'll really dive in with the rest of the panelists about what it means, what that myth has meant in our country and how it upholds the status quo, and kind of get into different questions and conversations that way. Afterwards, for the last 15 minutes, we're opening up for community Q&A. Feel free to use the chat as we discuss if things pop in, but if you have a specific question for the panelists that you would like answered, use the Q&A function down at the bottom there, and we'll do our best to try to address those questions during that time. I do want to give a shout out to Emily Dunkley, who's a program coordinator at UT-CSRD, who's been helping me coordinate this event. You'll find her in the chat as well. So thank you, Emily, and to all of our panelists for participating today. I'm particularly really eager to have this conversation because just a personal anecdote, my journey with my Vietnamese identity has constantly been evolving. As a gay man, it's been really interesting to see the ways in which the model minority myth has intersected with both aspects of my identity. And I share that because I want to acknowledge that this is an ongoing dialogue and the conversation continues to evolve, and each individual's relationship with how the myth has affected people internally and externally, I believe, continues to evolve. So my hope in that facilitating this conversation, we can really continue engaging with this topic at hand, become more aware of how the myth is being pushed, and think about the ways in which we can really start dismantling and unlearning some of the narratives that aren't in service of the community at large anymore. So with that, thank you again for joining. And I'll just go quickly into what Notley Tide is and our organization, and then we'll get started with, we'll hear a little bit from UT-CSRD and then get started with the presentation. So like I said, Notley is an organization that supports social impact initiatives across Central Texas, one of which the initiatives is Notley Tide. And so last year we were established as a way to ensure our nation's reckoning with racial violence, with violence against the Black lives, and that our nation's reckoning with race was sustained beyond the trending news cycle. So we provide and sustain funding and new donor engagement and resources for 5 different racial justice nonprofits, the University of Texas Center for the Study of Race and Democracy being one of them. And we offer different monthly community events and ways to stay engaged with the conversation. Some of our programs, like you see here, are that funding and donor engagement to our racial justice nonprofit partners. We've been able to raise over $200,000 to each of the 5 nonprofits. So we're really proud of our community that's been able to do that. We have racial justice community engagements in which we host different events like this to continue the conversation. And then we also have monthly emails as well that highlight the work that our 5 nonprofits are doing. And our third program is working with organizations, private companies, or otherwise on their diversity, equity, inclusion work internally as well. These are the 5 different organizations that we've partnered with in Central Texas. So we have Austin Justice Coalition Grassroots Leadership, who are focused on supporting Black and Brown communities and re-envisioning what public safety looks like in the criminal justice system. Texas Civil Rights Project and Move Texas has been really active in the legislative session, championing and ensuring that voting rights are secure and in place. And of course, our co-host today, the University of Texas at Austin Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, looking at holistically what this conversation looks like and how race has played a factor in our country's history and facilitating conversations just like this as well, with research and otherwise. For members, like I said, you get monthly email updates, call to action, ways to engage with the conversation and different suggestions on how to get involved with the 5 nonprofits or otherwise. And of course, your monthly contribution gets split evenly and 100% goes to the 5 nonprofits that we work with. For the corporate partners, there are different workshops and community events and training courses that we offer as part of our partnership with them as well. This is just a quick sampling of the different partners that we have. And so we're very thankful for them to help us to be able to continue doing this work and supporting great organizations like UTCSRD. We are culminating in a 1-year event next in a couple of weeks on June 3rd. And so it'll be talking with all of our 5 nonprofits that I had mentioned previously, as well as business partners, and really talking about the ways in which the last year has affected each of these organizations, right? So corporates who have said and gotten to the fight for racial justice, what does that look like for them for this past year? For our nonprofits who have received such a wide amount of attention in the last year, how has that growth and success been and affected those organizations? And then specifically how private companies or larger corporations or smaller organizations can work with nonprofits in this fight for racial justice to continue making sure that we're constantly having this conversation. And with that, I will introduce quickly UTCSRD and Dr. Peniel Joseph, who will say a little bit more. But as you may be aware, UTCSRD its mission is to facilitate anti-racism research and programming dedicated to reshaping those policies and leading an end to racial inequality. And they have various programs like this, but I'm really excited to be able to introduce Dr. Joseph, who holds a joint professorship appointment at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and History Department in the College of Liberal Arts at the UT Austin. He's also the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, and his career focus has been on Black Power studies, which encompasses interdisciplinary fields such as Africana studies, law and society, women's and ethnic studies, and political science. So with that, I will pass it over to Dr. Joseph.
Okay, great. Thank you, Minh. Good afternoon to everyone. Today is the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's really tragic death, and we remember him and his family, not just the protests that it inspired. We here at the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, has been in this space here in Texas for 5 years, and before that, 5 years at Tufts University. And our work has inspired 3 different centers, one at Arizona State, one at Tufts, and the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy here. And we really do engage in a number of different things, but what we are essentially is a hub for research and policy impact in terms of centering racial justice and democracy for all people. And we do a number of different things pedagogically. We do curriculum and development, but we also do public programs and conferences and symposia. And we also impact students through our fellowship program, our CSRD Fellows program, undergraduate and graduate who can become critical thinkers and innovators in this field across disciplines. So transdiscipline, whether they're interested in law and society and medicine, whether they're interested in nonprofits or becoming venture capitalists, this is going to impact them, and this is the world we're in. And this is a day to talk about solidarity. We're very much interested in using the tragedy that has happened to all of us, and not just the tragedy of George Floyd, but the tragedy of racism and economic injustice and inequality into a generational opportunity. So I think that the positives of the past year have been found in people being able to identify their own struggles and their own aspirations in the struggles and aspirations of others. And that's what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. meant by the beloved community, a community that was going to be free of racial and economic and all kinds of injustice. But not only that, that was going to reimagine citizenship as really a call to action, where everyone had food justice, and where everyone had housing and citizenship and dignity beyond voting rights, where racial segregation was a thing of the past, and also where violence. So there's so much violence in our world, and not just physical violence, but structures of violence, structures that marginalize people. We've all experienced it and seen it in the context of the pandemic. The pandemic impacted all of us differently. Some of us were able to work from home this past year. Some of us thrived this past year. Some people made billions and billions of dollars in the context of the pandemic, where over 500,000 Americans died, many more globally died as well. And so many have gotten sick and unemployed and seen catastrophe in their networks and in their familial and professional networks. So I'm always interested in thinking optimistically about issues of race and justice, but we have to do the work. And part of doing the work is having these conversations. But like Minh was talking about, it's also devoting resources. Last year, we have data that showed corporations in the context of the George Floyd protests pledged $50 billion. And in the last year, maybe 250 million of that has been paid. So what we see is that we need more than just heroic words. We actually need deeds to go with those words. And I think that what's so extraordinary about what we do here at the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy and in Notley and Notley Tide is actually turning those words into actual deeds. There's many different ways where you can get involved in works that the center does. We have in the chat, you can check out our website. You can donate. We are a nonprofit. We need support always. We are housed by the university, but we raise the money that we spend, right? So I'm really excited to be here today. Thank you to Notley and our partners at Notley. Thank you to Emily Dunkley, our senior program administrator, for helping to organize. And thank you to Elise and Eric and the panelists here, and Minh, of course. And I'm very excited about this conversation, because at the end of the day, this is a conversation about solidarity. Solidarity goes even beyond allyship, right? Because allies can come and go, but when you have actual solidarity, there's the recognition of your struggle in someone else's struggle, and that never, once you recognize that awareness never goes away. So really excited, and I'll bring Minh back in here to get started with this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. All right, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Eric Tang, who is an African Diaspora Studies Department professor. He's the director of the Center for Asian American Studies and directs the major race, indigeneity, and migration. His book, Unsettled Cambodian refugees in the NYC hyperghetto is an ethnographic account of refugee life in NYC's impoverished, socially marginalized neighborhoods. And Tang has published articles on race and urban social movements, including award-winning writing on post-Katrina New Orleans. He is at work on a second book, Fire in the Streets, revisiting the urban rebellions of the late 1960s. So without further ado, Dr. Eric Tang.
Thank you, Minh. And thank you to Emily for putting together this important conversation. It's great to be with you all this afternoon on Planet Zoom yet again. I don't know how much longer we have to stay on Planet Zoom, but while we're at it, let's have some rich conversation about a very important topic, which is the topic of the model minority myth. Now, it would seem as if something as benign sounding as the model minority myth would not convey something fatal, that it doesn't lend itself to fatality and morbidity. But on this anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, I want to begin by suggesting that something as innocent sounding as the model minority myth actually plays a role in the murder of George Floyd. I also want to suggest that it has played a significant role in the rise in anti-Asian sentiment and anti-Asian violence, which has marked this year and has inspired the hashtag that maybe some of you have seen circulating, Stop Asian Hate. So what exactly is the Asian model minority myth? And how has it contributed to this moment in which, again, Asian Americans are feeling under attack, but not only under attack, but they're feeling as if the violence that they experience is relatively invisible and that there's very little that they can do to stop it. They don't have the political power or clout to do much about it. And in addition to that, they are also feeling that no one really takes it seriously. What does the model minority myth have to do with that? How did we get here? And so to begin to unpack that, I want to just briefly sketch out some Asian American history. Asian migration to the US happens in two waves, or two primary historical trajectories. The first being during the late 19th and early 20th century, during an era that we might call the era of exclusion and colonialism. So Western intervention, European and US intervention in Asia, right? More specifically, Western imperialism and colonialism creates these internal disruptions in Asia during the late 1800s and early 1900s, which then pushes, if you will, Asians to migrate to the West in very large numbers for the first time in modern history. Essentially, the West went east, and therefore the East went west. Or to paraphrase Stuart Hall, we are here because Europe and the US was there. So Asians start to come to the US in very large numbers during the late 1800s, and almost immediately you see this reaction against the influx of Asian immigrants. Now, there were excuses and pretenses for why so-called nativist Americans, mostly white immigrants and settlers, were opposed to Asian migration. These pretenses included, well, they're stealing our jobs, they're changing the culture, but ultimately, the main reason why Asians were excluded was because the United States at that point was still a growing country. And in places like the West Coast, white racial dominance was not guaranteed. There was still racial contestation. We didn't know what the West Coast was going to look like. And of course, Asians are migrating from the West. Thus begins a period of anti-Chinese sentiment leading to the first discriminatory immigration exclusion law passed in 1882 called the Chinese Exclusion Act. So prior to 1882, we don't have any laws on the books that prevent any national group of any race or ethnicity from coming to the US. But in 1882, there is a law that explicitly excludes Chinese migrants, and then by extension, through the late 19th century and early 20th century, also then encompasses other Asian groups. And this explains why Asians have, throughout most of the 20th century, been a very small part of the population, up to and including the 1960s. So what happens in the 1960s? Well, we see major civil rights acts being passed. And one of these civil rights acts, although it's never really referred to as such, is the 1965 Immigration Act, known as the Hart-Celler Act. And this act effectively lifted nearly a century's worth of exclusions against Asians. It allows Asians to come in masse for the first time, certainly in the 20th century. However, it only allows certain Asians into the country. The state mediates which Asians are allowed in and which Asians are not. So in other words, the state mediates the racial formations of Asian Americans in the West, right, in the US. And these preferences, right, that it gives to certain kinds of Asians comport with a narrative that is taking shape from the end of World War II through the early 1960s, this narrative of Asians being a model minority. And we begin to see that narrative taking shape, if we can move to the next slide, following Japanese internment. So as many of you know, Japanese Americans, including those who were born in the United States, were sent to prison camps during World War II because they were considered untrustworthy and irredeemably loyal to Japan because they were Asian, because of their race. So whereas we were also at war with Germany and Italy, the Axis powers, it was only Japanese Americans, not German Americans or Italian Americans, who were sent to these camps. Okay. Now, by the end of the war, as the United States moves out of the war into the era of racial liberalism, this particular event does not comport with the way that the United States wants to be seen on a global scale as the paragons of liberalism, as the paragons of those who believe in equal rights. And so it's beginning to craft some revisionist history about what happened to the Japanese Americans. And part of that, part of the mea culpa, part of the desire, if you will, on the part of the United States to correct for this mistake that it made is to talk about how the Japanese Americans, despite this discrimination, were still doing well, we're thriving. So if we can scroll to some of the text on this slide. Here you have William Peterson in 1966 writing in the New York Times, barely more than 20 years after the wartime concentration camps. This is a minority that has risen above even prejudiced criticism. By any criterion of good citizenship that we choose, the Japanese Americans are better than any other group in our society, including native born, right? They have established this remarkable record, moreover, by their own almost totally unaided effort. Every attempt to hamper their progress resulted only in enhancing their determination to succeed, even in a country whose patron saint is Horatio Alger, the Horatio Alger hero. There is no parallel to this success story. Okay, so this is the revisionism. Yes, this racist thing happened to them, but look, they're making it nonetheless on their own, totally unaided. And I want to focus on that particular line. I'll come back to it actually in a moment. All right, so this is what's being told about Asian Americans, that yes, they experience racism, but that racism really doesn't count because look, they're doing so well. If we can move to the next slide. So as I mentioned, at the same time, the United States passed this 1965 Immigration Act known as the Hart-Celler Act, which eliminated a lot of the national origin discriminations that came from the previous century. And the act would allow Asians in, but allow them in based on a 7-category preference system. And if we move to the next slide, we can take a look at those 7 preferences. All right, so the first 2 have to do with family reunification, right? So you would get priority if you were the unmarried child over the age of 21 of US citizens who were, Asian and already in the States, right? Similarly, you would also be prioritized if you were the spouse of, of a permanent, or the unmarried child of a permanent resident, not a citizen. But the majority of people who got in under the 1965 Immigration Act fell under preference 3. And again, this is 1 to 7, like, you got more points, the higher you were on the list, right? So 3 was pretty high on the list. You had to be a professional, a scientist, and an artist of exceptional ability. This is how the United States redressed nearly a century worth of Asian exclusion. Yeah, we'll let you in, but only those who are professionals, scientists, and artists of exceptional ability. And then if you look at the 6 and 7 criteria, the 2 least important were workers who were skilled and unskilled, but not professionals, and then refugees. So turning to the next slide, what did this result in? It resulted in the United States being primarily the destination point for in this instance, Indian professionals. Between 1966 to 77, 83% of those who entered under the category 3 preference were, or 83%, I should say, of Indians who came to the United States entered under the category 3 preference. And this brought along 20,000 scientists with PhDs, 40,000 engineers, 25,000 doctors. So we can see, again, how the United States is determining, mediating through statecraft what Asian America will look like. Next slide. Okay. And this begins to sediment in the culture this model minority myth, right? That Asians are people of color of distinction, right? And what it does is it begins to distort the Asian American experience. It distorts Asian American history and what really happened to this particular racial population. It begins to sediment in the culture this notion that Asian Americans are tracked almost ineluctably into science and math, right? But again, this is all state mediated. And because they're not into politics, they're not into popular culture, they're not into leadership for that matter. We can just keep going. And it also suggests that their discrimination isn't something that we really need to take seriously, that we could overlook it because of how well they're doing. In addition to that, low-income Asian Americans are neglected because even as you brought in all these professionals, there were still workers and refugees who got into the country. And yet they and their issues become invisible. Next, right? But here's perhaps where the model minority myth did its most damaging work. In celebrating Asians who make it unaided, if I could harken back to William Peterson's New York Times article, what the model minority myth is really doing is it is issuing an ideological challenge to those who would argue that the United States suffers from systemic racism that needs to be redressed. Specifically, it is challenging the African-American freedom movement that during the same exact period, the mid-1960s, is fighting for radical redress of past racial discrimination. And so the model minority myth is part and parcel of a broader regime of anti-Blackness in this country. Asian Americans don't really need it. If William Peterson is thinking that he's giving us a compliment, I think most of us will say, that's nice, but no thanks. It's not really about us so much as it is about challenging, ridiculing, and ultimately undermining a Black freedom movement by saying, look, here's this other group that made it despite discrimination, without help, and without state redress. And that is why, as part of, again, a broader regime of anti-Blackness, it contributes to something as fatal as the murder of George Floyd. If we can move now to the next and last slide. Oh, actually the second to last slide. And what it also then does is it obscures the ways in which African Americans and Asian Americans have actually forged alliances against discrimination. And here is an example. Here's a New York Times ad that was taken out in 1979 by African American labor leaders and civil rights leaders urging President Carter to resettle nearly 1 million refugees languishing in refugee camps. Minh began this session by talking a little bit about his own experience. He's the child of these refugees. Well, the United States wasn't necessarily going to resettle these refugees unless it was pushed to do so. And it was by none other than the African-American leaders that were also leading the civil rights movement, okay? And so the model minority myth is meant to break that coalition, right? To undermine that solidarity. And if I can move now to the last slide, the question is, what time do we continue to live in? Do we continue to live in this moment in which the model minority myth has the ability to break these coalitions, right? As well as to contribute to this new surge in anti-Asian violence that we're experiencing, right? How does it continue to explain how anti-Asian violence in the United States is rendered invisible, right? And how does it, and this is like kind of an abstract or heady question that I'm gonna leave you all with, how does it continue to explain the forms of violence that are necessary to sustain the ways in which Asians are allowed to economically contribute while also being excluded from the national culture? And so what I mean by that is, even though the United States lifted exclusions against Asians in the 1960s, it was only so that they can contribute to the liberal economy and the soon-to-be neoliberal economy, right? But the racial formation of Asians, the racial discourses surrounding Asians that justified their exclusion to begin with never went away. And so you have this contradiction that you live in as an Asian American. I'm allowed to economically contribute and be part of, not only be part of, but be a paragon of neoliberalism, but I'm always going to be excluded from the national culture. That's an interesting paradox to live in. And the question I leave you with is, what forms of violence are needed to sustain that contradiction? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tang, for that presentation. I think it really tees us up for the conversation that we'll have with the rest of the panelists today. And I just want to hone in on the ways in which you really identified how true to what we're talking about today, upholding the status quo, that the state has kind of helped push this narrative for a larger, broader reason that although there may be some benefits to the Asian American community, it is detrimental at large to minority populations, specifically the Black community as well. So moving into our panelists, I really am excited to also bring our third panelist today, Elise Hu, who is a Los Angeles-based journalist and podcast host. She's currently a correspondent for Vice News Tonight on Vice TV and a host at large at NPR. As an international correspondent, she's reported for more than a dozen countries and opened NPR's first ever Seoul bureau in 2015. Before NPR, Elise has roots in Texas, having found the nonprofit digital startup, the Texas Tribune, in 2009 and spent more than a decade as a television news reporter. So I want to welcome Elise Hu to the panel and also bring back Dr. Joseph.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and thank you to all the participants who are here. This is a much bigger turnout than I expected, so I'm kind of nervous.
All good. We're happy to have you here, Elise. I'm going to start off first, just building upon a little bit of what Dr. Tang had talked about. And I wonder, Dr. Tang, if you could share what led to some of the Asian Americans to initially kind of ascribe and assimilate to the model minority myth, right? I think we know now better as a community kind of the origins of what that did. But when it was first introduced, this narrative, you talked about the New York Times article, were there some Asian Americans that kind of latched onto the idea, and why might they have done that?
You know, Minh, I don't know if that's really in historical evidence that, you know, even at the moment in which we feel like we're getting this kind of compliment, right? That there's this general, you know, new acceptance of Asian Americans as people who succeed by the American creed, that many Asian Americans celebrated that, and that it, you know, was something that they felt unambiguously positive about. I would say that at best, they felt ambivalent about it, in the same way that they felt ambivalent about, or in the same way that, you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color feel ambivalent about liberalism to begin with, right? Meaning that, you know, this notion of our equality now being granted is always a moment where we feel conflicted, because we also feel that in that moment, all that's happened to us is somehow being obscured, you know, is somehow being prematurely resolved. And so I can't say from a historical perspective that Asian Americans really took to this model minority notion in a real way. I think they might have used it strategically at certain points to survive and to avoid punishment, but that they really internalized it would be to kind of go against what they knew, which is that racism, right, was still very real in their lives.
And you mentioned this too. We know that as Asian Americans, we're not a monolith. I mean, the term encompasses so many different countries and stories and origin stories of how they're coming to the United States. And you've shared a little bit how this varied makeup, specifically those different points, the preference points, right, of immigrants, whether I think you mentioned at the very bottom were refugees and unskilled, quote unquote, laborers. And so how do you feel that varied makeup of the Asian Americans further dispel this notion? I mean, you kind of mentioned it already a little bit too, but wanting to hear, Dr. Tang, if there is, by the very notion of that term Asian American being so broad, it really, the model minority myth doesn't capture the entire diaspora of what makes up the Asian American community. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, you know, the case of refugees is the case in point. You know, Southeast Asian refugees who came to the U.S. penniless after the Vietnam War and the Cambodian genocide, they demonstrated in the census data throughout the 80s and into the 90s to have some of the highest unemployment and welfare participation rates of any race or ethnic group in the country, let alone among Asian Americans, right? And yet all of that gets obscured, is rendered invisible and unimportant or exceptional. And you wonder why that is. How is it that this could be ignored so easily? And it has to do with the overwhelming power of, you know, the model minority discourse as it relates to Asian Americans, right? Because here's the story about refugees. If you were really to tell their stories in a clear and rigorous way, it would not only challenge what the status quo is saying about Asians, but it would also challenge what the status quo is saying about African Americans. Because throughout the 80s and 90s, what you had were social scientists who were determined to say that welfare participation and unemployment were chronic issues for a certain racial group, right? That they tracked with the so-called underclass, which was code for Black urban poverty. But if you have this other group that is persisting in that same poverty, then what? Then your narrative about African Americans in urban America doesn't really hold.
Definitely.
Right?
Elise?
I could actually bring this to present day too, because as Asian or Asian American journalists in newsrooms, it actually took a long time for the racist attacks against people of Asian descent because of coronavirus to actually catch on in the national mainstream media, right, in the discourse. So it really, I mean, now there was obviously the Atlanta shooting and killings, but before that, there had been thousands of attacks going on in places all over the country. And a lot of activists were reaching out saying, like, there's not enough attention to this, right? And it wasn't until the racism and the racist attacks became quite extreme before a lot of white-led newsrooms paid attention to it. I can attest to trying to raise attention to this much earlier, after the start of coronavirus and the panic about Asians. But and correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation, right? But I do think the fact that we have such a binary view of race in this country, and the narrative around race tends to be so binary, that leaves Asians in a real sort of lonely place.
Minh, you know, what I add to what Eric is saying and what Elise is saying, and I agree with everything they've said, is that you know, the racism that Eric outlined is part of a long manifestation of white supremacy in the United States, but also globally in these imperial dreams. And the interesting part about racism and white supremacy is its connection to racial caste. And of course, Isabel Wilkerson has the book Caste. But one very, very powerful hinge point here is anti-Blackness globally. And so, you know, I would agree with Eric that it's not, I wouldn't say that, wow, the whole panorama of what we call Asian American and Pacific Island communities somehow embrace the model minority myth. I wouldn't say that. But I would say that really, and Toni Morrison and others teach us, just for a politics of survival, immigrants who come here do have to embrace a kind of anti-Blackness. They are aware that fundamentally there is a caste here that is the bottom of the floor, that people don't want to intermarry with. I'm saying by and large, I'm not saying discreetly, that doesn't have wealth. I'm saying by and large, not discreetly, whose lives aren't valued and who don't matter. But not just that. Here's where anti-Blackness reverberates always. Post George Floyd, before George Floyd. Your proximity to Black folks hurts you in this country. If too many of them live in your neighborhood, people move out. If too many of them attend your school, it's not a top school, right? Can you imagine Harvard University being 35% Black? Would we say it's a top school? I'm not saying 50 or 55, just 35%. University of Texas, if it was 35% Black, how would we think about UT? And it wasn't just Black folks on the football team and the basketball team. They were just students and professors, right? So I think what happens to Asian American Pacific Islanders is that they're caught. You know, they're caught. On the one hand, you don't want to be in proximity to Blackness, but on the other, you're uncomfortable about the way in which white supremacy positions you, right? And you get caught in that bind, right? And that's what Elise was talking about too. So I think it's very interesting. And I think the positive to this outline that Eric has said is that there's also a history of Black Asian solidarity. And that's the positive. So there's a history of Black Asian solidarity that often goes undiscussed. And it's in a lot of ways. Sometimes it's Black Asian anti-colonial solidarity. Sometimes it's people in the context of post-war America who were labor radicals. Sometimes it's the Nation of Islam saying we are Afro-Asiatic people. And Malcolm X, for a time, said he wants to join the Japanese army to get out of the war. But also there were people who felt that Japanese imperialism, maybe there was an anti-racist undercurrent to Japanese imperialism or imperialist dreams. So it's very complex. It's a complicated story. That keeps the iterations keep going. By the 60s, one of the first people who helped the Panthers get guns is Richard Aoki, right? And we know about his connection to the state now posthumously, but there's all kinds of interesting convergences where one goes. Eric's an expert on the Cambodian population, among other things, but in California, with Japanese and at times even Chinese Americans, there was real solidarity. And I witnessed acts of Asian Black solidarity growing up in New York in labor movements, people who were immigrants from Southeast Asia, who were immigrants from Vietnam, who were from the Philippines, Cambodia, and other places. So it's very interesting in terms of white supremacy, racial caste, and anti-Blackness.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I think that really addresses this idea, like I said, of who can achieve success in the country, and ways in which this narrative helps propel that idea of what success, what the pinnacle of success looks like in this country, and then eventually who then benefits from that narrative itself. I'm curious if one of y'all want to take this kind of, we touched on it a little bit, but some more modern ways in which this tension has kind of affected communities of color, but also the white community. So I think of Vincent Chen and his murder during the auto industry and the shortage of jobs there. How did the model minority myth kind of really start driving that wedge between, all communities, it seems like at that point, right? Dr. Tang, do you have anything to add there?
So the model minority myth lends itself to the scapegoat mechanism, right? Which is, without getting too into the theory of the scapegoat, the idea behind the scapegoat, or what it instructs us in, is that when you have racial hatred, for lack of a better term, for another group, you actually are not engaged in this linear bilateral relationship. Like, I'm a racist and I hate this other person, and that's all there is to know. Or the question begins with, why do I hate them? There's always a third party involved. There's this third unspoken element, which is our goals, right? Our goals in our desires to be white, to be masculine, to be a worker, to be a citizen, to be part of the nation state. And scapegoats are selected by those who share those goals as a common object of hatred, so that they might be brought closer to those goals, right? Mm. And so the triangulation of racism is where the scapegoat fits. The scapegoat completes one corner of that triangle. Without the scapegoat, there is no racism, and the racist can't even imagine a world without the scapegoat, because the scapegoat makes possible their desires. Does that make sense? All right. And so what is happening in the case of Vincent Chin and in other incidences of so-called anti-Asian hate is really the ways in which these forms of violence allow these groups to do what? To achieve, or at least achieve their perceived goals. And that is why the model minority myth, so to speak, is so dangerous, because what it does is it energizes and enables the scapegoat narrative. It makes agents available to be scapegoated.
Thank you. Elise, I want to go to you and ask, with representation in media, how do you feel that kind of reinforces this idea of model minority? I mean, we just went through a whole history lesson that thankfully Dr. Tang did, but I don't imagine that the general public is as aware of that history, other than what they're engaging with in mass media representation of Asian Americans and that narrative that's pushed. So how do you feel that kind of compounds kind of that model minority myth?
I can tell you that, in newsrooms, there's the idea, and when I was I grew up in Texas. Just, I guess I haven't really introduced myself, my background. I'm also the daughter of a refugee. My father swam to freedom in Hong Kong. He swam through the Bay of Shenzhen, like shark-infested waters, to escape communist China, because he had been sent to labor. He was sent down youth during the Cultural Revolution. And so he had swam and made it to Hong Kong, and then came into the US through the Hong Kong Refugee Act, which I guess was passed right after the 1970 or 1965 Immigration Act, or in tandem or something. So it was to help Chinese refugees that had escaped China. And I grew up in flyover country in St. Louis, Missouri, and then moved to Texas when I was 13. And in both places, I grew up in Plano, which had a few more Asians than St. Louis, suburban St. Louis. But in both places, I really internalized this notion of me being different, right? Because white was quite default. And I'm having to unpack that now in my 30s, because I don't think I really ever questioned the idea that my status, my value had to be earned, and that everybody else's status was sort of assumed, right? And so how that played out is this idea of sort of excellence in the meritocracy that I couldn't really trip up. And I know that's a shared experience now across a lot of marginalized groups in America, but it was something that I think I deeply internalized and never really thought through until, now in my adult years. Anyway, I say that as a prologue to say that when you grow up like this, there's this idea of sort of scarcity, of tokenization, right? And so as a member of the media, I could say that a lot of times I felt a lot more competition if there were other Asian American women who were competing for a job, say. So for example, there was a job opening to host All Things Considered, which was our national program at NPR. And I was a candidate for that job, but so was Elsa Chang, right? My good friend and another Asian American woman. And we sort of both knew they're not going to pick, they're only going to pick one Asian woman, right? There's the sense that that you're kind of, there can only be one of you, and that you must be exceptional in a way that's completely different than, say, Steve Inskeep and David Green, two white guys. Of course, you would have two white guys on a show, a panel of 4 hosts. You wouldn't have two Asian women, though. And so this is something that I guess doesn't speak directly to the question of representation, except that my idea of sort of casting, whether it's in Hollywood, whether it's in modeling, is that it's going to be white dominant, and then we are sprinkled in for flavor.
And to kind of go off of that as well, as we've seen with the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes and the Atlanta shootings, the myth seems to affect women differently, Asian women differently as well, in the narratives that are pushed there for them, and what people perceive as their traits or qualities or what have you. How has that kind of, if you don't mind sharing, if that, what your personal experience with that has been, and at large, I know you did a video about representation of different Asian women and characters in film too, and kind of what that narrative has pushed, Elise.
Yeah, just that we're fetishized, right? And turned into objects. And this actually has really colonial roots. in Orientalism, right? And so Dr. Tang talked about the late 19th century wave of imperialism, Western imperialism in Asia. And during that time, there was this idea of sort of the exotica, right, of the East. And Asian women were part of that. They were seen as objects to be sort of pillaged. And then that was the beginning of patient zero for the fetishization of Asian women, which is Madame Butterfly. This idea of this like savior white man coming and this Asian woman falling in love with him, and then he has to leave, and then she dies, she kills herself at the end, right? And that's replayed again in Miss Saigon, a popular musical that I guess it hit Broadway, what, in the 1970s or the 1980s? And no Asian woman that I know has grown up without hearing tropes like me so horny. And these ideas sort of feed upon themselves, right? Because what you see on the screen is so powerful. And so if you grow up in a place that you don't associate with a lot of, you don't have a lot of interracial association, you don't associate with a lot of Asian people, then what you see on the screen, these objects on the screen, the visuality of it becomes your idea of what Asian women are. And so then these images then get reproduced because that's what you were told Asian women are. And the victims, of course, are Asian women, right? Because now we are seen, because of portrayals in media that have lasted over a century, as hypersexual or objectified or objects to be fetishized, right? And it's problematic for Asian women. It's also problematic for Asian men, right? Because they get sort of feminized in a way that has then really hurt them. So yeah, I mean, the TLDR version of this is just that media representations are extremely powerful, and we get oversimplified and flattened in ways that are quite dangerous.
Right, and obviously we've seen the present day consequences of that, and part of what this conversation has elicited and what we're talking about now. I'm curious, Dr. Joseph, for you, you mentioned this a little bit about ways in which the coalitions between communities of color, specifically the Black and Asian community, have manifested throughout history. How do you see those coalitions happening currently in this Stop Asian Hate, Black Lives Matter instance? And what are things that we can learn from the past that can help us continue building upon these coalitions and kind of dismantling these notions?
Yeah, you know, I love what Elise was just saying, and you know, I think there's an aspect to this, just like what's happening in the Middle East, where we have to say it takes courage to say, you know, Palestinian lives matter, and saying that doesn't mean that you are somehow saying that Israeli lives do not matter. You're saying that Palestinian lives matter, right? So I think the positive about Black Lives Matter, and I think Eric pointed out, even in the 1970s, Black folks saying we want Indonesians and we want folks in, is that I think at its best, the Black freedom struggle, and I've seen this with BLM in big ways, is the cutting edge of democracy, not because Black people are special, but because of the historic position they find themselves in. And I think what you've seen with BLM, especially, I think the best Black Lives Matter march is the Brooklyn trans Black Lives Matter last June. Because the reason why, and I've written about this, you had over 15,000 people come out, and in other historical contexts, that would not have happened that way. You see what I'm saying? Because even within the Black community, just like Asian communities, we marginalize certain people, whether they're trans, whether they're women, whether they're poor. We have our own literal and fictive bête noirs in all communities, right? And so to see that was like, wow, this is so enlightened and so awesome, right? And it was such a search for love publicly, right? You know, justice is what love looks like in public, and that's what you were seeing in that march. So I think when you think about Black Asian solidarity, Black Latinx solidarity, just all across the board, I think BLM at its best has modeled that, even as we have earlier iterations, but we didn't have movements that at their core said, we want transnational solidarity. and we want solidarity across what Eric was talking about, scapegoats, because like I said, Black people have their own scapegoats. You know, it could be the Black person in prison is your scapegoat. You know what I'm saying? She's a lesbian, she's queer, she's the scapegoat. The welfare queen has been our scapegoat too, not just Ronald Reagan, because I've heard Black politicians talk about welfare queens. You see what I'm saying? So we have them too. So once you have no more scapegoats, what you do is have empathy, right? Once you're saying you are not to blame for the position that you're in, I understand about these structures. And so I think we've always seen some Black Asian solidarity at the grassroots, much more so than in the context of elites. It's easier for grassroots folks who are saying, I'm a Haitian immigrant, you're from Cambodia and Taiwan, let's get together, than at the high level of Stanford venture capitalists saying, we're gonna get together and do this Black Asian hedge fund or private equity firm. I wish they would get together and help us all out, but for the most part, it's the bottom up, right? And so what I've seen with young people, and again, I say that we give all credit to BLM and especially these Black queer activists, these Black radical feminist activists, and they are standing on these heavy duty shoulders, including of Asian American activists like Grace Lee Boggs and so many other folks who Yuri Kuchiyama, who were with Malcolm, who were with Martin, but they have said we've got to get together, and Asian American Pacific Islander violence is also a threat to my life as well, right? So at its best, we move away from the tensions that we saw in 1992 between Korean Americans and African Americans, what happened to Latasha Harlan. That's part of the history, and we have to acknowledge that. But at its best, we understand that there's more commonality. But I think the hardest thing for everybody to do, including Black people in this country, is to get rid of our anti-Black biases, because they're sewn in. Like we talk about, we weave white supremacy into everything we do, but we weave anti-Blackness into everything we do. The data tells us that once a neighborhood gets 7-8% Black, people who can move, they run to the hills. 7 or 8%. I mean, it's amazing. And by the way, we're 12% of the population. So you can't even be demographically represented before people run. They run. So you get 12%, right? But it's 7. At 7%, neighborhoods who can leave, they're running. The for sale sign goes out, right? And some of these neighborhoods are inured, right? You're not going to get 7% in Tarrytown or Hyde Park or Bee Caves down here, or the biggest parts of LA. I think, Elise, are you in LA? The biggest part, we have Baldwin Hills, but that's being gentrified too, right? The new in treatment has the Black therapist in the multi-million-dollar house because her dad was an architect. And I love it. I love that Black people have that excellence, but damn, most of us aren't gonna have a multi-million-dollar house. Most of our dads weren't Black architects. 60s and 70s. So even when they get to equity, it's like, this fantasy. But yes,
you have to be a superlative, right?
I want to, yeah, exactly. So we're seeing the coalitions now, but it's that deep empathy. Dr. King said, we're all part of the world house. And that's why I said, we have to talk about Asian American Pacific Islander violence, but we have to talk about Palestine. We have to talk about everything, right? Even though it's going to hurt some people, because all of our lives, of course, matter, but some of our lives are more endangered than others, which is why we say these things. That's why I said, I go back to the Black Trans Lives March, that if you want to go to a pivot point in American history and say, what was the most democratic moment in American history? It's in Brooklyn in June of 2020, and there's a Black trans lives, because we've said historically, those people don't matter. And what's so great, there were Asian Americans there were Latinx and indigenous folks there were white people there. And we were saying we were gonna uplift these people. So that's a dream, that's the beloved community in action, but we need policies to secure the safety and the human rights of those people.
Dr.
That's
Tang,
great.
Elise, do you want to add anything?
I couldn't agree more with Peniel's read of the most democratic moment in recent memory. And if I could add to that, it's because what they were also doing by way of their anti-racism was being transgressive. They were not just saying, well, here we are, recognize our humanity, here's some positive images that the status quo could kind of find palatable. And that is the trick for Asian Americans, right? The idea that you want to engage in an effective anti-racism, but you're in a bind because you think that if you prove your Americanness, if you prove all the things that they're saying about you isn't true, that you're going to somehow not catch hell. No, you're going to catch more hell, because what you've effectively done is reinforce their perverse logic to begin with. That makes you need to prove it. And
that actually reminds me, there were some of the Japanese who ended up being interned who really cooperated, right? Because they sort of believed that. They believed that, oh, well, they couldn't think that we're not the most loyal Americans. Of course, we're the most loyal Americans. We are cooperating with being interned.
Right. And look at this, Atlanta situation has got a lot of Asian Americans in a very complicated position, because they were frustrated with the media and they were frustrated with other Asian Americans who called the victims of the shooting, the Asian immigrant women victims of the shooting, sex workers. They're like, oh no, they really weren't. They were, they worked that much. We need to destigmatize sex work.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say, what's so wrong with calling somebody sex workers, right? I mean, it's an economic, right? It's contribution. It's labor, right?
But the desire to disidentify with it,
right,
as an act of anti-racism, only doubles down on the racism to begin with, right? Because it doesn't allow for an effective anti-racism that transgresses, that allows for a new kind of conversation, a more democratic conversation, as Peniel mentioned.
Yeah, I love that both of you have really emphasized the idea of solidarity. And when we talk about solidarity, that I think it's aspirational that immigrant solidarity not be rooted in bubble tea, right? Or rooted in elite colleges and universities, but instead be rooted in a care and a concern for the struggles of refugees and the working class. And if we could measure status in that way instead, right, and measure status in our anti-racism, then that's a society that I want to be a part of.
Yeah, and Elise, part of this is a pedagogical intervention too, where we can teach, and you could see, I think what's so extraordinary about the last year and now, both the progress that we've seen, but the assaults on the 1619 Project, the assaults on teaching about racial slavery, that's connected to Asian American and Pacific Islander communities in big, big ways, because they are intrinsically tied to that history. So where Africans were building the Transcontinental Railroad right here, Chinese, so-called Chinese coolie labor was as well. When we think about the West and the way in which Black bodies were exploited in the making of the West and the Homestead Acts and who was providing entertainment, it is Black and Asians. And so
and ditto sex work, right? Ditto sex work.
And sex work. Yeah. So we saying that you don't want to teach about Black history and racial slavery and that true complex history is really a whitewashing of Asian American and Pacific Island history too, because when you do that history, you wind up in the Philippines, you wind up in Hawaii, you wind up with these imperial dreams, even in the 19th century, both domestically and what's going to become the United States. Asia and Asian American immigrants are a big part of this, and Asia in a global sense, South Asian, Pakistan, India, you wind up with a much more complicated history. And by, the first line of saying, we don't want the Black history, they're really actually suppressing Asian American and Pacific Islander history as well, because they're part of that story. And just like we had racialized ghettos, we had Manila towns and Japanese towns and Chinatowns that are really born out of manifestations of some of the same things that happen to Black people, where then people are forced to do what Frederick Douglass and people call parallel institutions, where you create your own institution out of necessity. We at times want our own institutions, but we want access as well to everything and opportunity, but we've been forced to. And Asian Americans have also, one of the model minority myths that Eric talked about, but one aspect he didn't, they try to say that because Vincent Chin, somehow Asian Americans don't fight back. you got Asian Americans who are super duper hardcore and super duper organizers, and super duper, won't even say toxic masculinity, but they're going to defend themselves in the same way that Malcolm X, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Black people and immigrant communities have defended themselves and defend their lives and have real deep pride in their families. So all that gets whitewashed when we say we don't want to talk about the 1619 Project, because the 1619 Project is your project as well as my project. It's a global human rights project, but Asians are a huge part of that 1619 Project, however way you slice it, including the transnational cotton industry that Sven Beckert talks about. China plays a role there too, so does Europe as well. So this is them trying to stop our pedagogical intervention because of the Black Lives Matter movement. That's what we're seeing. People don't want all of this taught in K through 12. They're setting up bills. So this is a third American Reconstruction where they're trying to whitewash it in a deeper way than they did the first time from 1865 to 1898. And we're seeing it. That's why these voter suppression bills, but again, the Texas bills, no tenure for Nicole Hannah-Jones in North Carolina. They don't want us to know this history. They don't want us teaching this. And the assaults on critical race theory, they don't even know what critical race theory is. You don't even know what critical race theory is. And they're saying there are bans in Oklahoma, in Texas, and they don't even know what it is. That's how frightened people.
Before we move on to Q&A from the audience, which again, you can use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask, I wanna leave one question with y'all for a takeaway, just like one example that you might be able to share of how can we as individuals continue to dismantle the model minority myth. And so Dr. Tang, if you don't mind going first, if there's one example that you can share for our attendees.
Yeah, I think I actually mentioned it in my last comment, which is specifically coming out of the Atlanta murder, the shootings in Atlanta. As the shooter is gonna, be prosecuted and go to trial, I think it would be really important for Asian Americans and others to not shy away from the fact that these women were in the sex industry. And that's a complicated term. It's not, this homogeneous industry. So that's one concrete thing I would like to see us begin to have some conversations about. And then I think the other thing that we need to do is to understand that solidarity, right, with African Americans and other communities of color isn't just about statements, right? It isn't just about quote unquote showing up. It's about a certain practice. It's a political practice, meaning that solidarity can only really be actualized through projects and spaces in which we engage each other, right? And it's in that practice that you dismantle the model minority myth. There isn't a way to kind of, rhetorically get ourselves out of it, but there needs to be more political practice. And I think that is what I'd like to see in the immediate term, right? What are the projects that we can engage in that make solidarity meaningful beyond the hot take?
Thank you. Elise?
I would second everything that Dr. Tang just said, and just speak out to my fellow Asian American women out there. I think that we, a lot of us, and I know this is true just anecdotally through a lot of my conversations, a lot of us had gotten used to sort of keeping our heads down and not being as visible and not speaking up as much as we could have in order to kind of go along and get along, but also maybe as a play out, right? As actually playing out and role playing this role that we've been assigned by the dominant white class. And so I think in the wake of what's gone on in the past year, I have tried my best to talk a lot more about race than I ever have before, and be more visible. I agreed to do this, right? And I think maybe a year ago I might not have, right? Because I would shy away from these sorts of things. So to the Asians out there and Asian Americans out there, especially Asian American women, like make yourself visible, share your experiences. They're a lot more universal than you think, you know? And I think that they are the kinds of conversations that get us to, and we should lean into uncomfortable conversations and lean into complexity, because they get us to the ends that the ends that we hope for, which is like greater justice, right?
You know, very, very quickly, I think the biggest thing to do, which goes along with what Eric and Elise have said, is for the Asian American Pacific Islander community and your children to forthrightfully talk about centering not just racial justice and Asian American and Pacific Islander dignity and citizenship, but also Black dignity and Black citizenship. That's the, you know, that's the task, you know. So doing that certainly does not please white supremacists, as we've seen. You know, we're in a country where, you know, you have one political party that supports white supremacy unabashedly. There was a white supremacist riot at the nation's capital on January 6th of this year, and one party does not want that investigated. So we see the lines are as clear, more clear than they've ever been, because when you think about Reconstruction from 1865 to 1898, we didn't have the global social networks to understand what was happening simultaneously. We didn't.
Yeah.
We just didn't. Yeah. Okay. It's important to understand. So South Carolina, North Carolina, New York, China, we didn't have the networks to say, sure, here's what's happening in my neighborhood right now. Right now we do. We understand. Like, we all saw the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. We saw 15 to 26 million people, over 2,000 separate demonstrations. But we also saw the impact on the presidential elections, the Georgia elections, and we saw the January 6th assault on the nation's capital. And we saw folks with anti-Semitic slogans carrying Confederate flags in the Capitol Rotunda. So we know what this means now. And so for the Asian American Pacific Islander community, both citizens and immigrants, because we're all global citizens, the biggest thing to push away from that model minority is to say, look, I'm centering racial justice in everything that I do, in all my networks. And I'm centering Asian American Pacific Islander dignity and citizenship, but I'm also centering Black dignity and Black citizenship, because their struggle is also my struggle. And here's why, right? You don't need to be a 10-year expert in this. You know, this doesn't take decades of expertise. You can see it. We can see what's happened to Asian American Pacific Islander communities, especially the immigrants and the poor, and what Dr. King, the Bible teaches us, the least of these, and what's happened to Black communities that are parallel, that are analogous. So that's the easiest thing to do. And believe me, once, if we had Asian American Black solidarity like that, wow.
And just one more thing, because we have talked about the lack of education about this, like the lack of history. Dr. Tang's presentation was the first time I had ever confronted or been exposed to a comprehensive look at the origins of the model minority myth, frankly. You know, I'm 39 years old. So grew up a product of the Texas public school system. So I would just say that educate yourself, right? Because we're not necessarily getting taught a lot of this history. So please educate yourself. There's a lot of great resources out there now.
Yes, thank you all so much for sharing. I want to look at some of the questions from the audience. And I know, like I said, feel free to use the Q&A function. The first kind of harkens back to Dr. Tang's presentation, and maybe you might be able to speak to this, Dr. Tang, but how did the U.S. Immigration Services define exceptional ability? Kind of that's a good going question. Back to the preferences of the immigration.
I don't have a precise historical answer for that, but I will say it probably had something to do with whatever would really hurt and undermine the country, the sending countries. So we're going to take your best and brightest. And you train them, you put all the resources in, and we're going to boost them.
Well, yeah, Madeline Su, my colleague in history, her book on Japanese immigration in the post-war era certainly amplifies what Eric is saying. Like, the folks who came here from Japan in the post-war period were scientists and engineers and doctors. And there was basically also a kind of wealth quota where they came with enough resources where they wouldn't be dependent on any kind of social welfare from the United States. So it definitely was the cream of the crop.
And you have to also understand that a lot of these terms are used in very imprecise ways on purpose, right? So that they can then kind of be arbitrary and discriminatory in who they allow in. So it's not as if they then said, okay, exceptional means X, Y, and Z. They put it in there so that they could exclude at will and include when they wanted to.
Thank you. There's one question here, maybe for Elise and Dr. Tang, but speaking specifically about the conversations that we're able to have within our own community with our family members and our parents or immigrants who may not be college educated. This question asks about how might we be able to kind of start that conversation to understand the importance of the solidarity building that we're talking about. And I'll leave it at that.
I'll let one of y'all answer the question, but I'm going to share a quick story that makes me think of this. When I was at NPR, when we started Code Switch, which is our race, identity, and culture blog and podcast, which is fantastic, really enjoying a heyday now, having quite a moment. And one of the first story ideas, one of the first things that we wanted to talk about on Code Switch was all our parents are racist. And like, how do you talk to your racist parents, right? Because like we all kind of grew up in this soup of, you know, our parents having various, you know, racist sensibilities. And so that is a great topic. I don't know that we ever did the podcast episode, but with that, I'll throw it over to one of y'all.
You know, there are different tactics, right? I mean, one tactic might be to just ask them about their own migration stories and to get them to kind of bring out what I'm going to predict is their inner ambivalence about coming to the United States. You know, this notion that immigrants come and they kind of feel this transfigurative change upon arriving to the land of freedom and opportunity, all that is, you know, as I study this more as my career, is just not in evidence. There's so much more ambivalence. And ambivalence not meaning mixed feelings, but profoundly conflicted feelings about their passage, even if that passage meant they got to live. And I think maybe giving them the opportunity to kind of explore that, right, outside of the framework of the American dream and all that it conveys might be one way to start. And then to also don't underestimate their ability to hold an argument with you, right? I think part of what we do is we coddle our parent. Well, you know, they can't really have that conversation. Let me tell you, I'm a pretty patient and charitable interlocutor, especially during Q&A. But the one time my colleagues were like, yo, why did Eric, you know, go to war with this woman in the back of the room who kept just challenging? Later on, they're like, yo, that was his mom. My mom took one of my talks. And she was just like, wait, I got a question about, you know, welfare. Hold on, you know, and that to me was a great moment because, you know, it showed me that yes, she's not versed in what I do, but she has an opinion, and she was trying to have a generative debate. And so I think we also might want to give our parents a little bit more credit for being more complex thinkers than we might perceive them to be. I'll leave it there.
You know, very quickly, I would say with your parents, I think, and my mom is one of my political mentors and teachers, but we still have disagreements. I think that it's about empathy, and I think my mom, the way I can always get her to change her political opinion, if there's something a little knee jerk or something a little, you know, where I'm saying, hey, you're usually on a much more progressive bent, is really to tell her the individual story, you know, the individual story, right? And once she connects with the individual, whatever issue that she might have had before, it really clears the way because she's just interested in that person, their children, their hopes, their dreams. So I think that a lot of the divisions that we have, and a lot of times when our parents are set in their ways, it's because they're thinking about this in an abstract, and they're really not thinking about people and individual human beings and families, right? And unfortunately, America is a country, 350 million people. A lot of times structures treat us that way too, right? And the more, and this is where, again, Dr. King, when he asked for a revolution of values, in the sermon, remaining awake through a great revolution, a time of great change in 1968, that's what he meant by the revolution of values. He said that, the only way to understand the Kerner Commission, the only way to understand when he calls riots the language of the unheard, is to actually empathize with people and to see these folks as actual three-dimensional human beings who could be you, who could be your sister, your brother, your child, your parent. That's very, very tough. And this is why Dr. King's so incredible. He's calling us all towards this aspirational citizenship, right? And if you do that to your parents, I guarantee you a lot of times it'll open up channels, because nobody wants children to die. I'd say virtually nobody. Virtually nobody wants people to experience pain and suffering because they're gay, because they're poor, because they're Asian. You see, and once you put it like that to them, they'll say, well, so tell me more. I don't, most people aren't in favor of suffering on that kind of scale. But a lot of times we've got to make it miniature for them and not make it macro. People, I've found, the more I teach, my students respond when they find out somebody's story, somebody's actual individual story. And when you break it down to them at that granular level, they're much more able to empathize with one person or one family than 10,000 people. Because once we say 10,000 people have anything, whether they've died, they've suffered, it becomes an abstraction for us because our brains shut down. We can't imagine 10,000 people having something bad to them. So even when we think about mass shootings, it's better to tell somebody about one person who was a victim and to read about that person, empathize with that person, than to sort of show a picture of 500 faces. Because once people see the 500 faces, they just turn off. They just can't handle it, right? So our parents are the same way. We have to give them that grace and tell them about the people we're advocating for, and how those people are not much unlike them or us. Because again, our parents, virtually all of them love us. And if they love us, then they're going to connect to these stories that we're telling them.
Elise, Dr. Joseph, Dr. Tang, I want to be respectful of your time. We're right at 3:30. This was such a great conversation, and thank you so much for participating in it. Emily and I will be sharing a survey as well as some resources of things that were discussed here. There will be a recording available at a later date that will be shared as well. Thank you to everyone for spending your afternoon with us and engaging in this
Let's take this on the road, folks.
I really enjoyed it.
We'll do this again. One thing I'll leave everybody with is that we already have data now, and the Root has talked about this and other people. There are $50 billion in pledges last year towards racial justice, and the payout so far has been 250 million of the 50 billion. So it's important for us to think about accountability. What can we do to get that number higher? Elise, you're a media superstar. What can we do to hold corporations accountable who said that they were all in this moment? And as we know, we've got to be vigilant, right?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
So it's important for us to remember that we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it's achieved, right? We can't.
Thank you all for organizing, and thank you all for coming.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, take care.
Y'all have a good one. Bye.
Bye.